On today's show, we'll be joined by weekly co-host Ben DuBose to discuss a variety of topics. The Houston Rockets with a chance to change the narrative a little bit about the team and specifically about Coach Stephen Silas over this next stretch of games, this huge homestand that they have here in December to really show that some of the lessons, some of the culture is setting in here in Houston. We'll also take a look at Jalen Green, some of his shooting splits this season and some of the encouraging trends there, as well as who is the heir to the Houston Rockets starting small forward spot? The discussion around KJ Martin, Jae'Sean Tate, and Tari Eason eventually when the Rockets decide to move on from Eric Gordon. What does that look like? We're going to dive into all those topics and more coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start.
The Houston Rockets select Jalen Green and Jabari Smith Jr.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
Every time I step on that floor, I'm coming.
You're getting somebody who's going to come in with a chip on their shoulder, somebody who's going to come in and compete from day one.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays, host of the State of the Rockets podcast, as well as Rockets Watch. Be sure to follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin. The show, of course, at Locked On Rockets, free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, where you can help the show out tremendously by commenting anything below. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. Joining us now is your weekly co-host, the Podfather himself, and of course, Rockets Wire editor, Ben DuBose. You can follow on Twitter at Ben DuBose. Ben, look, this was a Houston Rockets season that, we'll be completely honest, right, started off a little rocky, and that was an expectation we had, right? Looking at the schedule, how brutal it was out of the gate. Rockets started off 1-9, although they were competitive in a majority of those games, except for the one against the Milwaukee Bucks. They've still been competitive in pretty much every single one of their games, minus the Bucks game that I just mentioned. They had that second game against Denver that wound up being kind of a blowout. Yep. And then the Golden State Warriors game on the road, second night of a back-to-back after that big win against the Suns. But now, over these last 7 games, the Rockets have won 4 games. Yeah. And it looks like they're starting to kind of piece some things together, starting to figure some things out. The young guys are starting to understand how to execute and close out games down the stretch. And now the Rockets have this pretty big chance here with this extended homestand coming up to really, I don't want to say make noise, but kind of prove that this team is more than what the record reflects at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a discussion a couple of weeks ago about Stephen Silas, and we were fairly critical, but in terms of what's happened since then, let's give the man his flowers. Look, they've won 3 straight home games, 4 of 7 overall. The most recent game against the Sixers, I think we both agree he was very good down the stretch of that game. He called a couple of timeouts at really opportune times. The one at the end of regulation that got them to 2 for 1. The one at the end of the first overtime that led to KPJ drawing the 6th foul on Embiid, ultimately tying the game, sending it to double overtime, and then winning it there. He made some really good calls, also had the play that he drew up for Jalen, which nearly won the game at the end of regulation. And in my opinion, maybe it does if Alperen Sengun is a bit more aggressive on the screen that he sets to give Jalen some separation. But yeah, Stephen, since that show a couple of weeks ago, has done some really good things. The team is improving, and this is important. I know a lot of people focus in and laser in on lottery odds, but it's important to get some wins along the way so that your guys like Jalen Green, like Jabari Smith Jr., like Alperen Sengun are in the right frame of mind every day when they come to the gym. They're believing something positive can happen, and that's good for their development. And I think it's especially important to consider that now in an NBA where the lottery odds are flattened. So again, I would not panic at this idea the Rockets could win some games, and it's absolutely possible because look, they've won 4 out of 7, as you mentioned, 3 straight at home. 7 of their next 8 are at home. And sure, there's a few contenders in there, the Bucks, the Suns, the Heat. But guess what? Of these next 8, first off, the one road game is in San Antonio, so they're not going to leave Houston, or they're not going to leave Texas again, until after Christmas, which is just insane. And of these next 8, 3 are against the Spurs, who they play twice, and the Magic. Those are 2 teams with a worse record than they have. So even if the Rockets lose to the contenders, if you just beat the Spurs and the Magic, and they've already beaten the Magic once in Orlando, the Spurs have lost like a bajillion games in a row. If you just win those games, you're going to be in a spot where you've won 7 of 15. And if you pick off any of the others, and we just saw them beat Philadelphia team that, they're not a contender now, but with James Harden and Joel Embiid, they certainly have the talent to be, then you could have a winning record over 15 games. And that's, again, it's not, but you have a parade for that, but it actually is a quantifiable step forward. It is progress. And in a year where Stephen Silas has to be judged on something, it's not necessarily wins and losses, but you do need to see something that makes you feel, and this gets back to our discussion a couple of weeks ago, that this team can be as good or better than the sum of the parts. Because, for example, when we did the player grades episode, and the only rotation players that I think we graded lower than a B or B minus that we put in the C or lower range were Eric Gordon and Daishen Nix. So if you're having all these young players that are playing to or perhaps slightly above expectations, then at some point you should see some results at a team level that reflect that. The fact that as of a week or two ago, you weren't seeing that, yeah, it is fair to question the coaching. Well, now you're seeing these bright spots in your prospects like Jalen and Jabari. The team results are not great, but they're starting to fall in line with that. And that's the sort of thing that, besides just, better vibes and it's more fun to go to games at Toyota Center, which is true, it also speaks well to Stephen Silas. We know this is a big year for him. We know it's the last fully guaranteed year of his contract. One way or another, they're going to have to make a decision. First off, as we said, is he going to finish the season? There was a point when they started 3-14 where we were talking about, look, did they make a midseason coaching change and go with an interim like John Lucas or Lionel Hollins? But longer term, what happens with Stephen? Even if he does play out this season, okay, you have to decide whether you're going to give him a second contract or not. And again, I'm not saying all of a sudden now I'm pro Stephen Silas, you got to give him that contract. No, I'm not saying that. This is just, 6 or 7 games. But this is a step in the right direction. And we should acknowledge that. This gives Stephen a chance. To me, that's what this schedule easing up. And in fairness to Stephen, the bad start, it was a really brutal scheduling draw. 10 of 13 on the road to start the year, which was, I believe, tied for the most in NBA history through 13 games. It was a bit unfair. Now the schedule is starting to sort of tilt back the other way. We're seeing some encouraging signs. And if that continues over the next 7 or 8 games, again, I'm not saying based on that I'm like, wow, let's give Stephen Silas a 3 or 4 year contract right now. No, I'm not saying that. But let's be honest. Let's give the man his flowers that he deserves. And let's be open to the idea that some of these concerns that we talked about in the past, maybe some of them can be improved. It's a long season and we're starting to see some positive signs.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And this next homestand, right, one of the underrated parts of that brutal start to the season, so many of the games on the road, is you get so little practice time, right? And practice time is so crucial for a group of young guys to really hammer home those principles, to understand, hey, this is where you need to be, this is what we're trying to execute, all that stuff. And so they're going to have this, 8-game home stretch with tons of practice time. They've got practice time even before and after this Spurs game because they've got 2 days off and then 2 days after the Spurs game with no other games on their schedule. So having all that to, having all that time to kind of coalesce and really get a feel for each other. And then you mentioned, right, the favorable matchups here in this next 8-game slate for the Rockets. San Antonio on the road. You got San Antonio at home. You've got one against Orlando. Those are 3 very winnable games. But even in that bunch, right, the Rockets have had a competitive game against Phoenix that unfortunately Chris Paul and Devin Booker closed out. And then they had the one that they just won against Phoenix sans Chris Paul. They've got Phoenix in that bunch, right? A team that they have beaten and that they've played competitively against. They've got Dallas in that bunch. A team that they went into Dallas and beat, granted, without Luka Doncic, but that Dallas Mavericks team is a team that is currently struggling. So, they're whatever their identity is. So there is a legitimate chance that the Rockets could come out of this little 8-game stretch of games and be above 500 after that stretch. I could see them realistically going 4-4, maybe even 5-3 across this next stretch.
And if that's the case, you end up with 8-7 or 9-6 over 15 games, which is really impressive for a team this young. And to your point on practice time, that's just so important for a team that's this young. We saw that over the week of Thanksgiving when they played relatively well the home game against Golden State on Sunday. Then they had 4 days off, which is a bit rare, but they did get to practice in that. And what happened after those 4 days at home with practices? They had the back-to-back wins against Atlanta and Oklahoma City over the weekend. And the game against Oklahoma City was probably their best game of the season, dominated it from start to finish. And I think that reflects that this is a young team that really benefits disproportionately relative to most teams, probably because of their age, from having practice and having that type of guidance and structure. And, that's the macro view. You can also look at it in the micro from Monday night against Philadelphia. Late in regulation, we talked about Stephen Silas calling the timeouts at the right spot. They were walking the ball up the floor with 38 seconds left in regulation. They were not going to get a 2-for-1. They ended up getting the 2-for-1, which led to KPJ, it was Jalen at the end of regulation that got the shot. KPJ was the end of overtime. But yeah, they only had that second shot that Jalen Green nearly made to win the game right then and there because Stephen Silas called that timeout and, prepped them on this is how we're going to handle that situation. And similarly, at the end of the first overtime, which is what led to the KPJ play where he drew the foul and Embiid fouling him out, and really the game was over right then and there. That was the biggest win expectancy play. There were 7.5 seconds left, and I think a lot of teams would have actually not called a timeout and just gone, the Rockets had it out of bounds, because with only one timeout left, and it was a 1-point game, even if you miss, okay, you can foul the Sixers right then and there, and even make both free throws with a timeout, you can advance the ball to half court and still get another shot. I think that's the way a lot of NBA teams, especially more veteran-laden ones, might look at it. The Rockets, with a team that young, Stephen Silas said, look, we need to just get our best shot here. There's only 7.5 seconds left, so even if there's another shot, it's only going to be like 1-2 seconds at most. Let's get this team organized. What ended up happening, I'm not going to say he drew it up to where he knew Joel Embiid was going to foul out, but I think it did help them sort of reset, compose themselves, and KPJ made the right read. He went inside, drew the contact, and ultimately that was the biggest play of the game. And that happened directly after the timeout. I think that's, again, credit Stephen Silas, but beyond that, it also speaks to the team benefiting, a team this young, from being able to prepare. That's something that I think is uniquely important to them, given the demographics of this team, and that could benefit them this month for sure.
Coming up, we're going to take a look at Jalen Green, some of his shooting splits this season, home, road, how he's looking, as he's progressing throughout the season, as well as we're going to take a discussion, a little detour down, what's the future of the small forward spot look like for this Houston Rockets team? Is Jae'Sean Tate even alive at this point? We're going to talk about that, but first, today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Next game, how about Jalen Green to score more than 26.5 points? What about Al P to have more than 8.5 rebounds? I think I'll take Scoot over on 5.5 assists. That seems pretty solid. And then what about Jabari Smith Jr. over on 3.5 threes? That seems like a pretty reliable offer. Now, what is Prize Picks, right? How does it work? Pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 25 times back on your money on any entry that you submit. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. Prize Picks offers projections on any sport that you watch. That's NBA, NFL, NHL, PGA, college football, you name it. They've got you covered over at Prize Picks. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that simple. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, let's talk a little Jalen Green here, Ben, because I think one of the, I guess I view this as an encouraging sign. You can push back on this if you don't agree with me or whatever, but one of the things about this Rockets season, right, is they have looked competitive when Jalen Green plays well. And that's how it should be, right? Yeah. When your franchise guy is playing well, when he's having a good night, when he's putting the ball in the bucket, you want to be a team that looks competitive and that you could go to toe-to-toe with anybody. And for the most part, this season, the Rockets have been able to do that. They've gone toe-to-toe with pretty much every team that they played, aside from the 3 that I mentioned, early on in segment 1 there. And that's an encouraging sign. And then you look at some of the splits, right? And some of how his numbers have kind of laid themselves out so far this season. And I think it's encouraging that he is, a trending up across these first 3 months of the season. Obviously, December, small sample size to start with, but he's trending in the right direction across a variety of categories: the efficiency, the scoring, the playmaking, which has been a big talking point as of late with Jalen. But what's really interesting, and you were the one that pointed this out to me, is his home versus road splits. I mean, Jalen plays so much better at home than he does on the road currently, and I wonder what that is. Maybe it's just atmosphere, pressure, what have you, because he does seem like a guy who gets up big for big games, whether they're on the road or at home.
Well, one thing that I wonder about, too, is if he gets a friendlier whistle at home, which happens a lot with younger teams and players. Like last night, for example, he couldn't make it 3, and that's part of it. Let's be honest. He's been in a shooting slump from three-point range lately, and even in Toyota Center, when they played the Sixers, he was 0 of 7. So some of that's not necessarily related to Jem. Some of it's just, he goes through, like any shooter, phases where he's hot, phases where he's cold. And
are we sure that Jalen Green isn't colorblind?
Yeah, well, I think Jalen Green's the reverse of Road Rhino. So you had Road Rhino, and we need to come up with some clever hashtag for, home Jalen. But no, I think part of it is, last night, even though he shot 0 of 7 the Monday game against the Sixers, he finished 9 of 20 overall. And his true shooting percentage was actually still pretty good. Shot 45% from the field overall, despite the 0 for from 3. Why? Because he shot 9 of 13, better than 69% from inside the arc. And he also got to the free throw line 10 times, making 9 of those. So again, some of that, perhaps he is a little more aggressive when he's at home, and that comes with greater confidence. Young guys are more comfortable, in scenes that they're sort of familiar with. But it also could be a friendlier whistle that, he's more willing to go inside because he doesn't think that, Tony Brothers is going to swallow his whistle if all the fans at Toyota Center are going to be on top of him, as they were a couple of times late in the Sixers game, So I think that can be, it's probably not a one-size-fits-all reason. I think it's a lot of things. I think as a team, I do think, and we've talked about this, the Rockets are now 4-5 at home this season. That's pretty good. They've won their last 3 overall. And I just think in general at home, it's a lot easier for especially the super young guys, which Jalen still is, year 2, 20 years old, to not panic and to stay within themselves. They can communicate better because, the crowd, thankfully Rockets fans have been fairly understanding of the rebuild, so you don't have too many, nights where they're literally getting booed by their own fans. It's easier to communicate. It's easier to stay in a positive frame of mind. If you need a timeout, then Stephen Silas needs to do that to recompose them. But it's not like when you're on the road and guys are all over you and you have the fans and it can just feel like a tidal wave of momentum. It's a bit easier to keep perspective when you're at home. And so, a combination of that, the friendlier whistle, I think that makes it maybe a bit easier to sort of just stay with it and to stay with the game plan, as opposed to on the road. Sometimes it feels like there can be a bit more hero ball where it's like, well, I need to get this shot up and make, the superhuman play, the big 3-pointer to really stem the tide and, stall that momentum that's building in the arena. Whereas at home, it's a lot easier to sort of just stick within the flow of what Stephen Silas is trying to do. So my guess is a combination of all those things, and certainly some randomness too. Again, this recent shooting slump he's been in, it didn't cure that just going home to Toyota Center. He shot 0 of 7 from 3. But I think the other elements of his game, the driving, the making the right reads, that's a little bit easier, especially when you're young, when you're in your own gym. And so I think between that and the friendly whistle, those are probably the factors going on.
And you got to imagine too, like over time, right? The kind of distance between what his numbers look like, right, in wins versus losses are eventually going to mellow out to where he's going to be a bit more consistent. Because right now he's still kind of pendulum swinging, right, where there's games where he looks really, really good. He's scoring at all 3 levels. He's getting to the free throw line. He looks unstoppable. And then there's games where, like this one against the Sixers, where he couldn't get it to go from 3, but he was just dominant inside the arc and he was getting to the free throw line. It's like, man, if he even hit a couple threes, you're talking about a 30 burger for Jalen Green. But his splits in wins versus losses. So the Rockets of the 7 wins this year, he's averaging 27.3 points in these wins, just under 4 rebounds and 5 assists per contest in the wins. In the 17 losses, he's averaging just 19.2 points, 4 boards, and 3.5 assists. And then the shooting percentages just plummet in the losses. He's shooting under 40% from the floor, under 30% from 3, and then under 80% at the charity stripe in the losses, whereas those numbers are significantly better in the wins. He's shooting 50% from the floor in wins, 38% from long distance, and then 81% at the charity stripe.
And by the way, I should have added in my last answer, you can see this with other young players too. I don't think with Alperen Sengun, the statistical difference is as striking, but you can see a difference in the mental approach. I think one of the things that was really encouraging to me in that Sixers game, we've talked in the past about Sengun's defense and the liability that he can be at times on that end. Look, Stephen Silas went back to him with 3 minutes left in regulation with 5 fouls and trusted him to go up against Joel Embiid. And in my opinion, he did as well, number one, as reasonable as you could expect in terms of contesting without fouling, throwing his body around. I actually thought he was a bit better than Bruno Fernando, who seemed to, he had a few moments against Embiid in that game, but Embiid sort of seemed to figure him out the deeper the game got into the fourth quarter. And there's a couple more inches there as well in terms of the size gap, whereas Sengun has an inch or two on Bruno.
Pause.
Yeah. But I do walk right into that. But I do believe that it was a learning experience for Sengun being trusted with 5 fouls, go up there against, a perennial MVP candidate, Joel Embiid, and he stayed out there. And part of it, it's the same dynamic as Jalen. He wasn't trying to make the superhuman play. He just went out there, tried to contest without fouling, didn't try to do too much. And I think, with Jalen, when you're a guard, that tendency can lend itself to inefficiency very, very quickly. Whereas, when you're big and you take your shots for the most part closer to the rim, you might not have those swings. But when your shot profile is the way it is as a guard, and it's as dependent on getting to the free throw line, the little things like, do you panic and, just go off script too early in the shot clock? Are you getting a friendly whistle? That stuff can disproportionately affect you. Whereas at home, if you're sticking with the process and you're sticking with the game plan, just little things like that can make a big difference. And even though I don't think it's going to show up statistically the same in a big man like Sengun, I do think mentally we sort of saw that same dynamic against the Sixers. I don't know if that game's on the road if Sengun is able to, play that composed against Embiid for basically 8 minutes, the end of regulation, and then in overtime, the first overtime that is, before Embiid fouled out, and then Sengun eventually fouled out as well. But I do think it was a positive learning experience for him. And I think on the road, he might try to do too much to make the superhuman play, or maybe he just doesn't get the friendly whistle that he did at home. I think it's a confluence of factors. But at home, it worked out. And I think that's the thing that's especially true when you're watching a team that's filled with so many 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds in the rotation.
Well, speaking of sticking to the process, it was very nice to see the Rockets stick it to the process in this most recent win against the 76ers. Sorry, I'm on one today. With that, coming up, I want to discuss the kind of, question mark at the small forward spot for the Rockets moving forward, because it's clearly the long-term answer is not Eric Gordon. So who is the long-term answer at the 3 spot for the Houston Rockets? Is Jae'Sean Tate actually still alive, or are the Rockets just kind of like weekend and burning him out onto the court where he's like there, waving, somebody's got like a stick up his arm and he's just kind of like, hey, what's up? It's Jae'Sean. We're going to talk about that, but first, today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all their sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis this season. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from football to basketball to soccer, even esports. They've got you covered for everything over at BetOnline. Right now, you can take a look at who the odds-on favorite is to go number 1 overall this year in the 2023 NBA draft. Spoiler alert, it's Victor Wembanyama at minus 1,000. But here's the funny thing. The next highest chance to go number 1 overall in this year's NBA draft is not Scoot Henderson. It's actually anybody other than Scoot Henderson has a plus 825 chance to go number 1 overall. And then Scoot himself has a plus 1,000 chance to go number 1 overall in this year's NBA draft. So for all of those odds and more, be sure to visit betonline.net to learn more about the trends and action available to you. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, as requested by a YouTube viewer of the show, John M., a question or topic for Jackson and Ben to discuss: who is the heir apparent to the starting forward position once Gordon has left and Tate is back? Is it Tate, KJ Martin, or Tari Eason? And I think this is a really interesting kind of discussion point, Ben, because the Rockets have so many viable options. I should say viable, legitimate small forward options, because Eric Gordon is not a small forward. And we've discussed before that, December 15th is the date to kind of keep an eye on, because that's the unofficial start of trade season. Guys become eligible to be moved. And we are now, by the time this episode releases, we will be 9 days away from that December 15th date. So, things may or may not heat up as far as Eric Gordon rumors are concerned. His name was kind of tossed about in some 3-team permutations along with the Phoenix Suns, a few weeks back. And it's very possible that Eric Gordon could be on the move. And were that to happen, the Sixers might need some help, as we saw Monday. There we go. Absolutely. Right. I mean, we saw the picture courtesy of Felicia Stone, Daryl and Rafael walking up to TC together and, talking about, well, hey, Eric can still play, man. They're collecting former Rockets, and imagine if Eric Gordon bumped Daniel House Jr. out of the rotation. That'd actually be pretty hilarious. Oh my goodness. Sidebar, because I think you were the one that pointed this out, right? At TC, cheers for James Harden. moderate cheers for PJ Tucker.
Yeah.
And then Daniel House Jr., when he first checks into the game, shout out to Jonathan Sanford for doing his best to hype up Daniel House Jr. coming into the game. Just not a peep from the TC crowd. I noticed it too. I think you were the one that pointed it out, though.
It was too staggering in the juxtaposition of just a few minutes earlier. Tucker and especially Harden, fans went wild. I mean, it was great to see them. And then Daniel House Jr., and people were just like, who the hell is that guy?
Yeah, what? Are we supposed to cheer for him? Who is he? No.
Yeah. Podcast ratings dead.
Oh, podcast ratings in the basement, man. Daniel's tuning into this and he's just like, oh my God, this guy. And he's gonna say for to house, for to team, for the algorithm at the end of the show too. Damn it. All right. So then when you look at this, what is it? Triumvirate? Yeah, there we go. That's the word. That's my SAT word of the day here. Yeah. Of possible options to fill that role. Maybe it's because Gordon gets traded. Maybe maybe the Rockets make a hard decision and they sit him down and like, hey, we need to start somebody else over you and we're going to move you back to the bench. Who knows? But in your eyes, who is best suited of those three to take over the starting spot?
And first off, I should acknowledge there was a fan who DM'd me the other day with a fun conspiracy theory that maybe they're holding on to Tate and giving him a few more days of rest because they have a Gordon trade lined up on the 15th. And then that way there's an easy rotation spot to plug Tate into and to give him some minutes. So I doubt that's what's going on, but it is a fun conspiracy theory. And now
I love that tinfoil hat theory. That's great.
Yeah. And now we're basically, almost within a week of December 15th, the unofficial kickoff trade season. So, it's fun to think about. But I think what's really going on, the Rockets felt a bit burned. I talked to some people in the organization before the season, and they felt that, Tate had some ongoing ankle issues going back to the offseason, and they thought that they really figured out what was going on there, and that basically if they shut him down for the period of time that they shut him down for back then, which was a couple of weeks, that would be all that he needed and he'd be good to go. Clearly it wasn't. They shut him down for a couple of weeks. He came back, played 2 or 3 games, and basically has not been seen since. And, insert weekend Bernie's, where the hell is he? We have seen him on the bench. He's a supportive teammate, so thankfully he is alive. I think we could verify that. But I do think that after feeling sort of burned the first time, they really thought that giving him those 2 to 3 weeks was going to be enough to sort of kick this, and then he's good to go for the season. It wasn't. So now I think you're seeing them err much more on the side of caution, but treating this like a 5-6 weeks. Look, let's really shut this guy down and gradually bring him back up. And I think he's not going to be the starter, and nor should he be when he comes back, for a couple of reasons. First off, I think his ball handling and his passing can potentially help you out with your Jae'Sean Nick's problem, because Jae'Sean, it feels like his play the last couple of weeks has really regressed, and you may not need a backup point guard if you have, now first off, you can stagger, as you've talked about, KPJ and Jalen Green a bit, but also if you have another ball handler and passer like Jae'Sean Tate, you can get by without having a true backup point guard. And so having him off the bench can make it easier to fill that role. But I also just think physically, you don't want to overextend him. If you're going through all this, you don't want to then turn him loose and say, yeah, he's ready for 30 minutes a game, starters minutes, even if you do think he's worthy of the spot. No, I think the best way to do it is limit him to 20, 25 minutes for the foreseeable future, have him, perhaps be a quasi backup point guard, even if he's a bit bigger, and just sort of give him a limited role, let him ease his way back in. And assuming he's healthy, it sort of lends itself to a natural timeline anyway, because give them, 6 to 8 weeks, and then the February trade deadline is right around the All-Star break. And then you can sort of reevaluate how healthy is he, how well has he played. And then at that point, maybe consider, putting him into a larger role if his play warrants it. For now, the clear answer to me is KJ Martin. He's been the best of that grouping all season, even if we include Eric Gordon for that matter. We've talked about that before. I think, certainly the shooting is passable. The athleticism, the rebounding is really important. The rebounding is an underrated skill to this team. I also think the length and athleticism, that's pretty important. We've talked so often about some of the limitations defensively when you start Sengun in the middle. And then when you start a 6'3" small forward who doesn't rebound, then it doesn't allow you to overcome some of those limitations when you don't really have a traditional rim protector. And again, that's not to let KPJ and Jalen Green off the hook, who aren't good defenders in their own right on the perimeter. KPJ did have some big possessions against Harden. Let's give him some credit. But by and large, I don't think either KPJ or Jalen's been a good defender this year. Not too shocking given their profile, given their ages, that sort of thing. But yeah, so when you combine that, when you combine a 20-year-old Alperen Sengun, not really a true rim protector, a 19-year-old Jabari Smith, who may be very smart on the defensive end, but he's just very, very green, and he needs to bulk up his frame, then yeah, you put a 6'3" veteran around them at small forward. Even if Eric Gordon is dialed in And, to Eric's credit, he was more dialed in against the Sixers. I thought that was maybe the hardest he's played all year. To get, playing a veteran team and seeing so many of his old friends, James, PJ, Daniel House, brought out the best version of him. But even when he does, just a guy that's that undersized, and you combine that with all of your other issues, it's pretty tough. Whereas with KJ, he has the length to really help you out, not just individually, but I think he fits a little bit better in the team construct this year. And then the other guy, Tari Eason, we love what we're seeing from him, but I think so much of his game is predicated on right now. He can be more than that in the future, but right now it's predicated on taking advantage of mistakes. We've seen how he can be basically like a magnet to the ball on both ends. And I think he benefits a lot from going up against, second units and, basically backups that are more prone to making mistakes. I think that's great for him to sort of build his confidence. And maybe, after the trade deadline, and one reason, to bring this full circle, we talked about, the schedule easing up and people are going to worry about, well, what does this mean for tanking? What does this mean for 1B and Scoot? Well, you can always, and we saw this last year, you can always lose more at the end if you need it. You can always shut more guys down. As we saw the Rockets down the stretch of last year, lost their last 7, even a pair at home against Sacramento. And I'm still astonished as to how they managed to lose those games. It was pretty amazing. And maybe that's the kind of thing late in the season, or then you can get Tari some run as your starting small forward, the same way you did with Sengun a year ago. And maybe that's the springboard, just as it was for Sengun, to take on more of a role with the ones a year from now. But right now, I think Tari's game, it's really beneficial for him to go up against backups. That energy, his, high IQ play, just how instinctive he is when basically there's any chance of, a loose ball or ripping it away. I think that plays disproportionately well against backups. I think it's allowing him to build confidence and build the right habits. And maybe you scale him up later in the year. For me, it's KJ right now. Not saying he's clearly a better player than Jae'Sean Tate, but he's clearly in better fitness right now than Tate. I think that's going to be the case even when Tate comes back for a good bit of time, because this ankle issue, again, when something like that goes on for months, it's clearly an issue. It's not like Tate's going to come back and be ready to play 30 minutes per game. So I think KJ's the guy right now. And then, once you get past the trade deadline, once you get past, the All-Star break and we're down to that final 6 to 8 weeks, then yeah, maybe at that point we can reevaluate and say, hey, where is Jae'Sean Tate at? How well is he playing? Is Tari Eason ready for a bigger role? And, just taking play into that and, so on and so forth. But for now, in my opinion, if there's no Eric Gordon, and maybe even if there is Eric Gordon, KJ Martin's the guy.
Yeah, I think, and to your point, you kind of, paused there for a second and you said, well, I don't know if you can clearly say KJ is the better player versus Jae'Sean Tate, like in a vacuum or whatever. I think you can easily, though, maybe you can't make that argument possibly because they both have their strengths, pros and weaknesses. But I think you can clearly say he's the more complementary player for those other starters. Yeah. And I think that's the big key, right? Is he fits a little bit better with what you want next to Jalen, next to Scoot, all of that.
He does have the better length. He gives you more potential as a rebounder. That athleticism could be really important in that unit. Yeah, I think he's, at least right now, a cleaner fit as well.
And I think I track with everything that you're saying, and I fully agree. I think the move is to kind of bring Jae'Sean Tate back a bit slowly, right? And again, I think you could very easily just 86 the minutes for Daishen Nix and give, those 10 to 15 minutes a night to Jae'Sean, and then maybe trim some of the other minutes from the rest of the Goon squad. And you're getting him those 20 to 25 minutes a night. And you're going to look like a much, much better team because of it, because offensively, he's a bit more polished, a bit more consistent. You're not going to have those crazy swings up and down that you get with Daishen Nix. You lose out on a bit of the shooting. That's the one downside, but we also don't know if that increased three-point shooting is actually real or not. All of the reporting in the offseason told us that Jae'Sean Tate suddenly had a heater, and we haven't really, gotten a chance to see if that is true or not. But I will say, I agree with your point about Tari Eason, and I do think that his skill set, his play style, his energy is best served right now, kind of coming off the bench. He is a bit more raw, and it allows him to kind of muck things up a little bit, right? Like I compared him, once upon a time to a David Nwaba type, which Tari's ceiling is already incredibly higher than David Nwaba's, but same archetype of player, right? You come in, battering ram off the bench. What I will say is I think that in some type of a lineup permutation where they completely get rid of Nix and like Tate takes over the backup ball handler responsibilities, I would be curious to see if starting Tari made it easier for them to potentially also run Usman Garuba a little bit at the 4 instead of exclusively as a 5 with that 3-headed dragon at the 5 spot. Then I could get behind the idea of Eason taking the starting spot and KJ still coming off the bench, because then your bench unit becomes Tate, KJ, Garuba, and Bruno, and then you're kind of, instead of having to cycle all three guys at the 5 spot, you get Garuba some of those minutes at the 4 spot by balancing out Tari and giving him more minutes at the 3.
Yeah, it's a fair consideration. And it's something that, Stephen Silas has been pretty creative. Say what you will about whether it makes sense, but, it's difficult to play 11 guys in the game, and that's what he's been doing lately. And to do that, you have to have some rather unorthodox patterns. You can't just run, your typical NBA rotation where you've got 8 or 9 guys and your starters play the first, 8-9 minutes of the first and third quarters. You've got to do some things outside of the box. And it's something that you should at least, I would say a tool in the toolbox. And, we did see it, I thought, against the Sixers. It was rewarding Tari for his strong play. He had like 18.6 rebounds in just 20 minutes. I mean, he was an animal off that bench, getting to any loose ball. And even when the balls weren't loose, just ripping them away from guys. And we saw in the fourth quarter, there was a stretch in which it was basically Tari and the starters. Well, I think at that point it was Bruno instead of Sengun, because they brought back Gordon and Sengun with 3 minutes left in the game. But before that, it was KPJ, Jalen,
Tari, and Bruno for a solid 2 to 3 minute stretch.
Mostly a starting unit, and that was late in the game against a team they were clearly trying to beat. That was a game they were taking very, very seriously. And I think, that's an example of just, even if it's in a small sample, then you can do that. And it's beneficial to Tari, get him some reps in a different environment, let him, taste what it's like. But it's also, it shows like Stephen Silas being willing to think outside the box. And that's something that clearly they're going to have to do if they want to play even close to the amount of guys that they're playing now, plus Jae'Sean Tate.
I want to give Silas the credit there. I don't know if I would go so far as to call it thinking outside the box. I think it was more so riding the hot hand, right? Because Tari had the big third quarter. We see him do that consistently, right? I will give him credit on that. He has those moments where like a player plays big and then he opts to give them that extended run like in the fourth quarter, right? Bruno has a big game, so he plays late into the fourth. Garrison has a big game, so he plays late into the fourth. Tari had a big game, so he got some crunch. Like Silas made it a point to put Tari back in the game in place of Garrison Matthews so that he would get some of those, those 2 to 3 minutes at the end of, regulation before Eric Gordon came in to close things out. So I'll give him credit. I'll give him credit for being creative with it. I just think it's also a recurring trend that we see where a player has a big night and Silas rewards that player by saying, hey, all right, you're having a good night. All right, I'm going to give you, some time in the fourth quarter to keep going.
Although, to go to the other extreme and be a bit critical, it is really strange, by the way, how, Garrison Matthews played really well against the Hawks. Let's give him his flowers. Like, he was instrumental in them coming back and winning that game. And yet it feels like, before then he was just out of rotation. Now it's like based on that one game, he's a fixture. And in many of these, including last night, he was bad. It was, a struggle when he was on the court. I was surprised he was playing high leverage fourth quarter minutes. And to Stephen's credit, he did seem to finally recognize it and go back to Tari. But yeah, for all the talk about wanting to play more young guys, and they still can't find minutes for Josh Christopher. We've talked about that ad nauseum. But, the fact that Garrison Matthews, after really not playing well, and I guess, we can't point out there are all the reports that he looked good in the offseason, blah, blah, but even if he did, look, he's mid-20s. I don't think his archetype is something that's really going to fit on this team long-term. He's not really a prospect you're trying to develop. And so, to go to the other extreme, I do sort of see the frustration when, it can be so tough for some guys to get minutes. And then all of a sudden, one game, and, we love Gary Bird, we love the meme, we love, everything that goes with that. But the fact that all of a sudden now it feels like that trust factor is all the way back. It's odd. It's one of those things that's not worth making a mountain of a molehill, especially when, again, they won. They've gone 4-3 in the last 7 games. But it was a bit odd. I'm glad that, finally Stephen seemed to recognize it and made the change when needed to Tari, and then of course we're back to Eric to finish that.
He's a Silas Trust guy. He's in the Silas Trust circle along with Eric Gordon, along with Jae'Sean Tate. He's there for better or for worse. Garrison Matthews is one of those like comfort players that Silas likes to play because he's got the shooting, but unfortunately, like if he's not hitting shots, he's not bringing you a whole lot else, unfortunately, and that's the downside with Gary Bird. But Ben, it's been a fantastic Rockets conversation today. You know the drill. Let our listeners know where they can track you down at.
Yep. Ben DuBose on Twitter, the Rockets Wire on Twitter, and then the Logger Line on Twitter as well. That's my weekly podcast with Paolo Alves. We'll have good stuff later this week because guess what? It shouldn't guarantee that the Rockets are going to win, but there's a good chance that the Rockets can win at San Antonio. And all of a sudden you can, at that point, really feel like you're starting to make some real progress.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcast. That's Apple, Spotify, Google, the Odyssey app, free and available on all podcast platforms. We're also available on YouTube, where you can help the show out tremendously by usually commenting anything below. But how about for this one? How do you feel about the starting small forward spot, right? Who do you want to see as the starting small forward of this Houston Rockets team? Is it KJ Martin? Is it Tari Eason? Is it Jae'Sean Tate? Let us know in the YouTube comments. We do read each and every one of those every single day. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.